Welcome to In These Times, a multi-platform podcast and YouTube broadcasting channel for mental health issues. We want to address mental pain and emotional suffering by bringing you information that can alleviate your distress. And you may make some important mental shifts that bring back your light, your love, your hope. Please use the Contact Us button on our website to let us know your deepest troubles and concerns with your mental health. Help us to help you. In this series on depression, we've been trying to bring light to the profound darkness made worse by the COVID pandemic. What started as anxiety about the future may have led to a terrible sense of helplessness and a real wish to leave this troubled world. This is a painful subject, but we felt that suicide, and indeed the prevention of suicide, are subjects that we should talk about. In his career as a psychotherapist, Previn has helped hundreds of people in despair. So with his help, I hope we can understand what takes people to that point when ending their lives seems the only way out. So, Previn, I think if we look at this in psychological terms, trying to see what gets into people's minds, how does someone get to the state when they actually think that's the only way?
Yeah, it's not something that happens on a turn of a dime, although that is what suicidal people actually feel, that it happens very, very quickly when they act on it. It is an accumulation of a long period of time. And if you think about the dominant emotion, which is what psychotherapists do, the dominant emotion in suicide has to be hate and anger. Because if you think about it, it takes an incredible amount of hate and anger to actually end your life. It's a very aggressive action. And to get there, because it's so unnatural in one sense that you're taking your own body away from the world and you're going to end everything in your life, the hate and the anger has to be massively intense. Now, this hate and anger didn't just appear one morning. It's an accumulated depression that has accumulated over time, over numerous micro events where the person has not dealt with their emotions, they've not processed things, they've actually tried to look after other people too much. That's one of the commonalities about people who commit suicide. And they want to protect the ones they love. And often they get worse and worse and worse in that accumulation of depression. And that just tips them over the edge. But the other thing I would like to say quickly, Chrissy, is that you have this powerful emotion of hate and anger, but the suicidal person doesn't recognize any emotion. No. Okay, they're very cold, they're very shut down to themselves. And if you actually ask them or start talking to them about suicidal ideation, what you get is this complete opposite of hate and anger. You get a trance-like shutdown. It's almost as if it's a self-hypnosis. And they go into this trance where the only possible action left for them to do is to end their life. And it is quite a psychologically disturbing thing because it can happen to rich people, famous people, as much as it can happen to people under social and economic stress.
But, it happens to relatively few people, thankfully. I think if you say to those people before they do this act that they are feeling hate, they simply, as you say, they wouldn't understand that. All they understand is complete helplessness, that everything is beyond them. They can't make sense of anything in their lives. It's pointless.
The pointlessness forces the question, so what would be the point of living? How did you come to a stage where you thought your life was pointless? Because it assumes, therefore, that you did at one point think that there was a point to your life, yeah? So to feel that empty and helpless and powerless doesn't have to lead you to death. And that's the thing that the suicidal person has to kind of work with in therapy, which again, it's a very difficult, complex subject, is to unpack why do you feel your life has no value. And as I say, there was a spate of rock stars in the last few years taking their lives. And these are people at the peak of their success with massive followings, and they committed suicide. So it is a case of how do you get to a feeling of pointlessness, and what gives your life a point?
Yes, but if you've gone that far, then you can't see any point of actually talking about it.
That would mean you're in a trance state, okay? If a suicidal person can't admit to anyone else that they have suicidal thoughts, that they have suicidal ideation, they are lurching towards a trance-like stage, and then it's deadly, definitely, because at that point they are going to self-hypnotize themselves into the action. And usually the way that goes is there is a pre-planning. They plan their suicide secretly to themselves, and it's all very silent, you see. Then they start to find they're increasingly thinking about the plan, and that's when, on a turn of a dime, they can suddenly act on it. Now, at that point, they are in a trance state. So you have to try, ideally, to catch the suicidal person before they get into the trance state. And Chrissy, we're back to talking about feelings, aren't we? That people don't talk about feelings. They don't admit how much they hate their lives or hate themselves. They don't admit that they want to kill themselves. And there has to be a space where people can do that.
So as a therapist, in comes this person in this trance-like state, but it's your job, a thankless task, is to spot the signs and stop them.
Yes. In the therapeutic setting, and I must stress that you do need training to do this, and the conditions of the therapy room, but in the therapy setting, you can talk into the suicidal feelings and thoughts and planning. Because if you have a trust with your client, if you have a psychological connection with them and they sense that, they can start to open out and start to admit that this is what they are actually planning to do with their life. And what you do in therapy is not to then try and block it off or push them off to help or tell them to get to medication or rush them off to hospital. What you do in therapy is say, tell me more about your plan. You talk your way into the suicidal thoughts. You talk into the suicidal action. And what it does is it breaks that trance. It unwinds and unravels the trance that they got into, where they felt isolated, alone, it was all secret, and suddenly now they're talking to another human being, and that snaps them out of that pressure to act upon it, and you get them out of the trance state if you're lucky.
But it must be a nightmare. I mean, a therapist, though, they go through an hour, they know someone's thinking about it, they've told you how they're going to do it, and yet you have to say, well, lovely, see you next time, and off they go. I mean, how do you know they're not just going to go and do it there and then?
That brings us to a really important point about suicide, okay? We are not God. If somebody decides or actually has chosen to take their life at a very deep, deep level, nothing and no one can stop them. Not the best therapist in the world, not the most greatest expressions of love. If someone has got to that stage, it is really between them and life, their life. And sometimes it is the most agonizing thing as a therapist, where if a client takes his or her life or their life, then there was nothing you could do about it. So there is this horrible thought inside all of that, which is at some level, the suicidal person, who of course is at risk to themselves, yeah, has the right at some point to say, I'm not going to do this anymore, and then take their own life.
When you talk to Samaritans, I'm sure worldwide people have the Samaritan system where if you're feeling that bad, you can ring somebody who you don't know. It's like talking to a therapist you don't know. When you do talk to Samaritans, they say their key is not that they're God or wonderful or can talk them out of it. It's just the fact they were there to listen. And that seems to make a great difference.
And there we have it. You see, it is breaking the trance. It's breaking the isolation. It's breaking the self-hypnosis that you have no one to talk to about this horrible fact that you want to kill yourself. You want to end your life. And you know that would be devastating if you shared that with anybody that you loved or anyone in your family. And the good thing about helplines is that literally it snaps people out of that trance isolation, then it makes it harder for the suicidal person to act on it because they know that there's another human being that knows, that cares, that has made psychological connection with them. And that's what sustains the suicidal person from one therapy session to the next.
And neither you or the Samaritans will be judgmental. You won't start saying that's a very selfish act, which is what people say in families.
Yes, this is one of the popular myths that happen, sadly, after somebody has taken their own life, that they were very selfish. Now, there's a fantastic book by Alistair Campbell called Living Better, and it is a brilliant portrayal of somebody who was very, very suicidal, suffered from intense depressive bouts. And there is the link again between suicide and depression. He's very angry in that book because he says people say that suicide is a selfish act. And he says, but the suicidal person absolutely does not think they are selfish.
Well, you hear people who said they got very close and they thought it'd be a great relief for all their families, actually.
That's spot on. And that's what the suicidal person is thinking. They don't want to be a burden to the ones they love. But then this comes to the accumulation of depression, you see, because they've actually spent all their lives trying to please the people they love. They spent all their lives trying to protect the people they love. Campbell's Living Better book is fantastic because it's very clear that the two people he really loved immensely were his own wife, Fiona Miller, and also the Labour Party, which was symbolised in Tony Blair. And he constantly felt this pressure to please them both. And he couldn't do it. He was just a human being. Yeah. But it was this pressure to protect them, to please them. And of course, when he fails, he attacks himself viciously with that hate we talked about, that anger, and then he hates himself for not making them happy.
Talking of men, it is interesting, isn't it? 75% of suicides committed by men under 45. That's the figure since the 1990s. So many more men than women and younger men.
Yeah, so society has changed because the only value in social life nowadays is money, and human life has none. Now, this has been accumulating, over centuries, that men are not allowed to value their life or their feelings. They have to be militaristic, and all of life is apparently this big military battleground that they go into and fight their way through. And they're supposed to harden themselves against feeling. Well, unfortunately, the bad news for men is they are human beings. And the human brain is not wired to shut down feeling. We are relational. Now, men are not able to have relationships where they feel and can receive love and emotion. They are obsessed with having to pay bills, having to achieve a career, losing their jobs, going nowhere for years in the same old job. And these kinds of pressures affect men not just in terms of suicide, it affects their self-esteem, it affects their relationships, it affects their sexual functioning. There's a whole space of things which in the end are making more and more men feel useless, unwanted, unvalued, and they have no purpose or place in society.
So are you going to just blame society, or should we blame their mothers for making them like that?
We could blame anybody that we wanted. In therapy, we don't try to blame. What we try to do is unpack the causality, help people to see their personal history. Look, how on earth did you get here? There is a story. Let's get into this. It didn't happen overnight. You started like this a long, long time ago when love was a very fragile thing for you. And you didn't feel loved, you didn't feel there was self-worth. And as a man, as you grew up, you were not allowed to receive feelings. You were always having to give.
Now, the really difficult thing, and this is really addressed to people who have lost somebody through suicide, I think, having been through it in my own family, I think there was an overwhelming desire to know why and what had happened, and to kind of treat it like a mystery, or how did it happen? Go back to places where the person was, talk to their friends, to try and make some sense of it. And I think a lot of people try and do that, don't they?
You can't make sense of someone else's personal history, because by the time they do something as severe as this, as self-hating as this, the number of reasons have become so complex that you on the outside cannot keep track of it. Now, of course, this is one of the problems of the suicidal person, that they can be bright and chirpy, very successful. I think of a pop star, Robbie Williams, who was with Take That. And while the band were very successful, they were all together. But when he started getting into conflicts with the lead singer, Gary Barlow, wanted to sing his own songs, couldn't, Williams went into a suicidal state. And he felt like he was drowning. And yet he was supposed to be working with the people who loved him the most, the Take That group were together as a team, but he didn't feel heard. He didn't feel anyone was listening, and he didn't feel an emotional connection. Despite all that work, all that activity, there's no emotional connection. Now let's transplant that to families. It's not a case of blaming anybody, but that suicidal person has felt isolated and shut down and cut out. And that's why they can't go to families. And when they commit suicide, the families are left wondering, what on earth should we have done? But it's too late. And it doesn't, you have to find a way to move on.
Tragically, the families often sink into a great sort of denial about what was going on for that person. They won't look at their lives or what might have led them because it's all just too unbearable.
And it's self-accusatory, you see, because you then start wildly guessing that you could have done this, you should have done that, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. And there's a lot of didn'ts that start to pop up and intrude in your head while you are trying to make sense of it. Now, the difficult thing is to grieve the loss and give up the explanations, because you can't get into the mind of the person who is dead. It's all over. And that, of course, gets us to what we were talking about in our grief and grieving interview, which is that death is a very hard thing to face, but it is a finality. And what you have to do at that point is not keep trying to explain it, trying to understand it, although you will, and it's very human to do that, but it's not really going to give you any answers that will satisfy you. You have to go through a grieving process with suicide and find a way of mourning the loss, expressing the grief, and then trying to move on with your life. But you won't do it unless you enter into that grieving process.
If we look at someone who tried to take their own life, didn't succeed, goes back to the family circle, and the family circle are they just don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. And, you know, they're looking for someone to say, right, this is what you need to do now.
When you have somebody in your family that has survived a suicide attempt, they are in a very raw and sensitive state. But what usually happens is that they want to carry on as if everything is normal. And everything isn't normal and never was. Now, the difficult thing is to get the suicidal person into some form of counselling or engagement with the emotions behind the action. And unfortunately, Chrissy, usually if you are functioning back at work and it's business as usual, the psychiatrists and the doctors are very happy with you. And so no one wants to address the fact that there was a huge amount of emotion that led to the act. Where is the space for the suicidal person who has survived an attempt to unpack that feeling? And often they don't want to, because it's so painful. It's also embarrassing, the action that they've done. And they don't want to face the guilt that they've left with all the family members, that actually you lot could be part of the reason why I nearly took my life. So it's a very raw thing. It's a very raw state. And that's unfortunately why families and the suicide survivor often don't want to get into any kind of emotional engagement about what happened. And by all means, try and search for that kind of help. But the way forwards is not to pretend it didn't happen, not to kind of go, oh, let's get on with Christmas and New Year. It's a way of saying we need to talk as a family about what has happened. And I don't think that can actually be done just in your front room. You need somebody with technical skill, technical background, who can walk you through all of that pain.
So if somebody's tried once, thankfully it has not been successful, but they've gone back to life, gone back to work, gone back to the family, can another trigger come along at some point which will make them try again?
Yes, because it depends how that person has resolved the action in their mind. Now, if they want to pretend that nothing has happened, they are in a very vulnerable state, because they're going to continue the same behaviours. They're going to continue the same push down of their self-hate, their anger, trying to protect the people they love and finding that they're not being recognised and there's no gratitude for what they're doing. And there's no understanding for their life. Now, if they carry on like that, that's going to accumulate. Usually they will exit the family and move on, or they can be vulnerable to another trigger and it can occur again. Now, we are also talking about a mid-range age range. We're talking about 45 plus. If you go lower down to younger people, there can be several suicide attempts. And what happens with young teenagers and younger people in the 20s and 30s is literally that nobody's listening. So we're back to this problem that no one makes that connection that we're talking about with these feelings of self-hate and wanting to kill yourself.
But they don't know they're happening. I mean, you can be a perfectly loving mother who has no idea that your child hates themselves that much they want to kill themselves.
So there's something about the perfect loving mother that might need to be rethought, okay? And that there is some kind of emotional disconnect that's going on between not just the mother, it's the father, it's also the brother, it's also the sister, that somehow this individual has become emotionally cut off to such a degree that they hate their life. Now, that can't be thrown at just one person. And it isn't a case of blaming anyone either. It's a case of we are all part of a big society that doesn't value human life. And that's why we act that out inside the home, inside our families. So there's no point blaming families and saying, oh, well, you didn't have an emotional connection with your child. Society isn't interested in emotional connections. So we have to understand that we are living in very vulnerable times. And if families are going to survive and children are going to survive, what's needed from parents is a way of emotional connection, emotional attunement with their children. That's at the lower end. And of course, at the higher end, it's about people who are feeling absolute hate for their life because they can't find jobs, because they've lost their business through COVID, because they can't see a future, because they don't know they haven't got enough money to go out and date a girl. They don't have any relational world and support. They feel utterly useless. Now, life is more than all of those things, okay? It's about feeling. And certainly in our interview on parenting and couples breakdowns, we can talk a little bit more about attachment theory and the mantra in attachment theory, which is life without feeling is death. Okay?
You see, you talk about society. Everybody's very, very busy. They're very scared at the moment because of COVID, because of their jobs, because of money. And yet, you know, there's an expectation that you are able to look at your child, for instance, every day, every moment of every day, and spot these signs of self-hate. See, I just don't think it's possible.
Yes, there was a very interesting dark satire called Outnumbered with Claire Skinner and Hugh Dennis. And in that series, there was a brilliant portrayal of a family, typically middle class, that is so disconnected in every way between the mother and the father, between the parents and the children, between the children and each other, and the children and the parents. And that has almost become the accepted norm. That's almost become the thing that you're proud of, that at least I've got a home and I've got my children here and we live this disconnected life. But you know what? We've still got houses and we've still got the home. Now, unfortunately, families and homes are not built on money. Families and homes are built on feeling. And that's where we have to shift to. And when you're talking about the kind of anxiety that has been created by COVID, you really have to reset your values and say, okay, what is going to matter to you? Is your life really about paying the bills and nothing else? Or is it about the fact that even if you can't pay the bills, your children still love you and you can love your children and you can let their love in?
I'm getting at why you talk about self-hate, which is not exhibited to the world when someone is thinking about suicide, and yet you're also expecting people to spot the signs. How are they ever going to know?
I think you can't spot signs when it comes to self-hate and suicide, okay? You can superficially do that if they are constantly looking depressed, if they're unable to come out of their room, if they're constantly irritable, aggressive, and will not talk, if they don't have friends around them, if they're getting increasingly isolated. Superficially, those are the signs, but people can do that and actually be very much okay with themselves. So there are no obvious indicators if you look at behaviour. And one of the incredible things about suicide is the number of times people say, we just had a drink the night before he killed himself. I remember that about Michael Hutchence, the lead singer of INXS. And his friend was in utter disbelief that just the night before, they'd been sitting on the balcony, chilling out in Australia, drinking beers, and then he killed himself. So suicide is not a sign-spotting thing. It's about knowing people beyond the surface level, and it's about an emotional attunement that, hey, you're not happy. You have all of this success, and it is incredible that it happens to particularly pop stars. You know, you have all of this success, you have all of this adulation, and you feel so much hate at yourself. What on earth is going on? You're not a happy person.
The other problem is because, as you've said, it's so secretive the moment when you make the decision that you're not going to go around the place. I mean, some do. Some will ring up the Samaritans or find a therapist, but some people just think, that's it, I'm going to do that deed, and there's really not a lot the rest of the world can do about it.
Once that action is made, and remember, it's going to happen in silence, okay? There is nothing anybody can do, and we just have to face our powerlessness in that. That is some mechanism that has triggered off in them. They were at risk. They didn't get any help and support. Nobody identified it and rushed them off to A&E or rushed them off to some kind of helpline. If they knew that all that support was available and still acted out the plan, none of us have any power to stop them, because they will do it secretly, they will do it silently, they will not tell you when they're going to do it. Sometimes even they don't know they're going to do it. And then the moment arrives, in that perfect moment where they think, I'm going to do it, and it's all over. So I don't think as survivors or helpers trying to look on, we need to feel guilty or blame ourselves or attack ourselves, because we are not God. It is excruciating when that happens. It slices through you that somebody close to you did that. And that's the grieving process that you then have to go through with a counsellor, because it's a very particular type of grief, because it involves hate, it involves anger. It's not particularly about losing a loved one and having fond memories about them. This is a very, very aggressive action, and the impact on the survivors is devastating.
Yes, and it does stay with people for many, many years. It's a terrible waste of life, and people think about it for a long time to come.
Yeah.
So that's been very helpful, and thank you very much indeed, Previn.
You're welcome.
In These Times is entirely based on your participation and your involvement. Please use the Contact Us button on the website to let us know your thoughts. Please also make a donation so we can go on bringing you more broadcasts. Help us to help you.